It began not with gunfire or a press conference, but with silence. In a modest home in Nigeria, a family waited through the night for a phone call that never came. No message, no official update, just headlines flashing across television screens claiming that everything was under control. According to those reports, 11 Nigerian Air Force personnel had already been released after an emergency landing abroad. Yet inside that living room, nothing felt resolved. Silence has a way of telling its own story. Here is what we know. A Nigerian Air Force C-130 transport aircraft departed Lagos on what was described as a routine mission to Portugal for maintenance. Shortly after takeoff, the aircraft developed a technical fault and made a precautionary landing in Burkina Faso. On board were 11 Nigerian military personnel, 7 officers, and 4 airmen. What should have been a straightforward technical stop quickly became an international question mark. Within hours, major media outlets in Nigeria reported that Burkina Faso had released the crew and that the aircraft would soon continue its journey. Government-friendly headlines echoed the same message: the matter was settled. But then another voice emerged, one far less comfortable. According to information shared by people directly involved, the crew had not been released at all. They were still being held waiting for formal clarification of their mission. Families back home had received no calls, no confirmations, no proof. That contradiction is where this story truly begins. This is not just about an aircraft or an emergency landing. It is about communication, accountability, and the cost of confusion when governments speak without clarity. Burkina Faso reportedly asked for something simple, an official written explanation confirming that the mission was authorized and non-hostile. Days passed. No formal letter. Only denials, counterclaims, and a growing fog of misinformation. For a country of more than 200 million people, how does this happen? How do soldiers disappear into diplomatic silence while headlines declare victory? And when truth and propaganda collide, who pays the price, the officials or the families waiting by the phone? These are not anti-government questions. They are the most basic questions of leadership. If you believe accountability matters more than comforting headlines, please share this story. Subscribe if you believe truth is more important than denial. And in the comments below, tell us what you think. Should silence ever be an acceptable response when a nation's own officers are involved? To understand why this incident escalated so quickly, we must return to the facts, plain, chronological, and undisputed in their sequence. The aircraft at the center of this controversy was a Nigerian Air Force C-130 transport plane. These aircraft are not unusual. They are workhorses used worldwide for logistics, humanitarian missions, and maintenance transfers. According to available accounts, the C-130 departed Lagos, Nigeria on a flight bound for Portugal, where the aircraft was scheduled to undergo routine technical maintenance. On board were 11 Nigerian military personnel, 7 officers, and 4 airmen assigned to accompany the aircraft. Shortly after takeoff, the flight encountered a technical malfunction. Aviation protocol is clear: in such situations, safety comes first. The crew made the decision to carry out a precautionary emergency landing. The nearest suitable airfield was located in Burkina Faso, reportedly in the country's second-largest city. From an aviation standpoint, the decision to land was neither reckless nor unusual. What followed, however, was anything but routine. Burkina Faso authorities treated the landing as unauthorized. This distinction matters. An emergency landing does not automatically remove the obligation of a foreign military aircraft to provide formal diplomatic and operational clarification, especially in a region where airspace violations have historically been linked to cross-border military actions. In recent months, West Africa has seen heightened sensitivity around airspace sovereignty and foreign military movements. Burkina Faso, in particular, has adopted a firm posture on territorial control. As a result, the aircraft was secured and the 11 Nigerian personnel were temporarily detained pending clarification of the mission's purpose. This was not, at least initially, described as a hostile act. Reports indicated that the personnel were being treated properly, with diplomatic channels open and Nigeria's embassy aware of the situation. At this stage, the issue remained administrative and diplomatic, not confrontational. The turning point came not on the tarmac, but in the media. Within a short period, multiple Nigerian news outlets began publishing similar headlines. Burkina Faso releases 11 Nigerian military personnel or detained Air Force officers freed after emergency landing. These reports cited unnamed officials and framed the situation as resolved. To the average citizen, the message was clear: the crew was free, the aircraft issue settled, and Nigeria had handled the matter competently. But beneath those headlines, critical elements were missing. There was no publicly released diplomatic note, no formal statement confirming that Burkina Faso had accepted Nigeria's explanation of the mission, and no evidence that the crew had resumed their journey. Most tellingly, families of the detained personnel received no direct communication, no phone calls, no messages, no confirmation from military authorities that their relatives were safe and on the move. Then came the contradiction that reignited the entire controversy. Information shared by individuals closely connected to the situation stated clearly that, contrary to government-linked media reports, the crew had not been released. According to this account, Burkina Faso authorities were still waiting for official written confirmation from the Nigerian federal government explaining the mission and affirming that the aircraft had no involvement in any military operation against neighboring states. This detail is crucial. Burkina Faso's position, as described, was not based on hostility toward Nigeria, but on procedure. They wanted documentation, a letter, a formal explanation. Without it, the personnel remained in place. At that moment, the story ceased to be about an emergency landing and became something more troubling, a question of state coordination and communication. How could reports of release circulate widely while the basic diplomatic step, formal written clarification, had allegedly not yet been completed? How could a situation involving uniformed personnel abroad be declared resolved without verifiable proof? For a nation of Nigeria's size and influence, this gap between headline certainty and operational reality raised uncomfortable questions. Not about aviation, but about governance. Not about foreign hostility, but about domestic responsibility. And that is why this incident did not fade quietly. Instead, it exposed a deeper issue, one that would soon dominate public reaction and fuel growing distrust. The moment this story reached its emotional peak was not defined by official statements, but by the growing distance between what Nigerians were being told and what they could clearly see was missing. As headlines declaring the release of the 11 Nigerian Air Force personnel continued to circulate, a troubling detail became impossible to ignore. No evidence followed the claims, no photographs of the crew departing, no confirmation of arrival in Portugal, no recorded statement from Burkina Faso acknowledging a resolution, and most striking of all, no contact from the detained officers to their families. In military matters, silence can sometimes be strategic. In humanitarian matters, silence is devastating. Family members began asking simple human questions. If they had been released, why had no one called home? Why were wives, children, and parents learning about the fate of their loved ones from social media rather than from the government or the armed forces themselves? These were not political questions. They were questions of dignity. Public frustration intensified when individuals with apparent access to first-hand information contradicted the official narrative. According to those accounts, the crew remained in Burkina Faso not because of mistreatment or hostility, but because the Nigerian federal government had not yet formally communicated on paper the details of the mission. Burkina Faso, they said, was waiting for clarity, waiting for confirmation, waiting for a letter. This revelation transformed public anger into something sharper suspicion. If the solution was so simple, many asked, why had it not been done immediately? Why was the country hearing confident claims of resolution, while the most basic diplomatic requirement appeared unmet? To critics, this was not merely an oversight, it was a pattern they recognized all too well. The reaction online and in public discourse was swift and unforgiving. Some accused the government of prioritizing image management over truth. Others pointed to a deeper cultural problem, a tendency to deny uncomfortable realities rather than confront them directly. Comparisons were drawn to past situations. Kidnappings minimized displacement, downplayed mass violence, rebranded as isolated incidents. The same script, people argued, was playing out again. Instead of transparency, there was contradiction. Instead of accountability, there was deflection. Commentators also brought history into the conversation. Burkina Faso, they noted, had previously detained foreign operatives from far more powerful countries. In one widely cited comparison, 4 French intelligence agents were held for an extended period, forcing France, one of the world's most capable military powers, to negotiate carefully and ultimately pay compensation before securing their release. The implication was clear: Burkina Faso does not respond to pressure, bluster, or denial. It responds to formal process. This comparison only deepened public concern. If France had been required to follow protocol, why would Nigeria be treated differently? And if Nigeria failed to follow that protocol, why was the public being told the matter was already closed? The climax of this episode was not a dramatic confrontation between states, but a collapse of trust at home. Nigerians were left navigating a maze of conflicting headlines, hostile online exchanges, and unanswered questions. Journalists were accused of spreading misinformation. Citizens were accused of disloyalty for demanding proof. The truth became a battleground rather than a shared goal. For many observers, this was the most dangerous stage of all. When people can no longer distinguish between verified information and official reassurance, cynicism replaces confidence. Every statement is questioned, every denial is suspected, and every real problem becomes harder to solve because belief itself has eroded. By this point, the issue had clearly moved beyond an aircraft and its crew. It had become a test of credibility, one that exposed how quickly authority weakens when clarity is absent. The nation was not asking for miracles. It was asking for honesty, documentation, and respect for the intelligence of its citizens. And as the noise grew louder, one uncomfortable truth settled in this crisis was no longer unfolding in Burkina Faso. It was unfolding inside Nigeria itself. As the confusion dragged on, the consequences began to spread far beyond the airstrip in Burkina Faso. What started as a technical aviation incident had now evolved into a civilian and political problem, one that exposed deep cracks in public trust and state responsibility. For the families of the 11 Nigerian Air Force personnel, the situation was emotionally unbearable. These were not anonymous figures in a news report. They were fathers, sons, husbands, and brothers. Days passed without direct contact. No official military liaison reached out to explain what was happening. No reassurance came from Abuja. Instead, families were forced to rely on rumors, social media arguments, and contradictory headlines to piece together the fate of their loved ones. In any country, this kind of uncertainty takes a toll. In Nigeria, where insecurity and kidnappings are already a painful reality, the psychological impact was amplified. If civilians can disappear into forests for days or weeks, people asked, what does it mean when even uniformed officers abroad seem to vanish into diplomatic silence? The fear was not just about these 11 individuals, it was about what their situation symbolized. Politically, the damage was just as severe. The federal government's apparent failure to communicate clearly with Burkina Faso, and just as importantly with its own citizens, reinforced a long-standing public perception that denial is often chosen over direct engagement. Instead of confronting the problem head-on with transparent updates, officials appeared more focused on disputing reports, labeling criticism as misinformation, and insisting that everything was under control. This approach had consequences. Each denial invited more scrutiny. Each confident statement unsupported by evidence weakened credibility. In the absence of verifiable facts, citizens filled the gap with speculation. Trust eroded not because of what Burkina Faso did, but because of what Nigerians felt their own government failed to do. The political implications extended even further. Nigeria is a regional power, a country that often positions itself as a stabilizing force in West Africa. Incidents like this challenge that image. If a government cannot swiftly and clearly account for its own military personnel during a diplomatic incident, it raises questions about coordination, preparedness, and seriousness on the international stage. Critics were quick to connect this episode to broader patterns. Past controversies over internal security operations, displaced populations, and disputed casualty figures were recalled as examples of the same governing instinct: minimize, reframe, deny. In this context, the C-130 incident became another chapter in a familiar story, one where official narratives struggled to withstand public scrutiny. For ordinary Nigerians, the lesson was unsettling. When information becomes unreliable, people disengage or grow hostile. Civic unity weakens. Patriotism turns conditional. Citizens begin to wonder whether loyalty is being demanded without accountability in return. From a civilian standpoint, the cost was emotional exhaustion. From a political standpoint, the cost was legitimacy. This was no longer about whether the crew would eventually be released. It was about how the state responds when challenged, whether it chooses transparency or convenience, clarity or confusion. The longer the silence persisted, the more lasting the damage became. In moments like this, governments are judged not by their strength, but by their honesty. And for many watching this unfold, the real crisis was not happening abroad. It was unfolding at home in the fragile relationship between a state and the people it claims to serve. From a global standpoint, incidents like this are rarely judged by their technical details alone. What the world watches most closely is how a government responds under pressure, not when everything goes right, but when confusion sets in. For American audiences, particularly those who lived through the Cold War, Vietnam, and decades of diplomatic crises, this pattern is familiar. Nations are not weakened by accidents. They are weakened when leadership fails to communicate clearly, decisively, and truthfully. In Washington, crises involving military personnel abroad typically trigger immediate briefings, formal diplomatic notes, and visible coordination across agencies. Silence is rarely an option because silence creates space for speculation, and speculation quickly becomes instability. That is why this case drew attention beyond West Africa. Burkina Faso's position, as described by multiple accounts, was not radical by international standards. A foreign military aircraft entered its airspace and landed without prior authorization. In such cases, even among allies, documentation matters. Written clarification matters. In today's world marked by drone warfare, covert operations, and regional proxy conflicts, airspace violations are treated with caution, not assumption. From a European perspective, the precedent is already clear. France, despite its military power and long history in the Sahel, was forced to negotiate carefully when its intelligence operatives were detained by Burkina Faso in the past. Power did not override process. Protocol did. Seen through that lens, this was never about hostility toward Nigeria. It was about sovereignty. For U.S. policymakers and analysts, the more troubling issue lies elsewhere. When official narratives shift, rapidly released, not released, clarified, denied, it sends mixed signals to allies and observers. Markets react to uncertainty. Security partners question reliability. Diplomacy becomes harder when internal coordination appears fractured. This matters because Nigeria is not just another country. It is Africa's most populous nation, a major energy supplier, and a key security actor in West Africa. When Nigeria appears disorganized or evasive during a relatively contained incident, it invites uncomfortable questions about how it would handle a larger crisis. Globally, there is also a broader shift underway. Countries like Burkina Faso are asserting a more rigid interpretation of sovereignty, less willing to accept informal explanations or historical privilege. This trend, whether one agrees with it or not, is reshaping Africa's relationship with external powers. It is also reshaping expectations within the continent itself. At the center of that shift is a new political tone emerging from Ouagadougou, often associated with President Ibrahim Traore, a tone that emphasizes procedure independence and resistance to pressure. For international observers, this approach signals that old assumptions no longer apply. Documentation must replace influence. Transparency must replace entitlement. For Americans watching from afar, the lesson is not about choosing sides. It is about understanding how credibility functions in the modern world. Governments earn trust through clarity, not repetition. Through evidence, not insistence. As global attention drifts toward Africa's evolving role in security and geopolitics, incidents like this serve as quiet warnings. They show how quickly a manageable situation can damage reputation when communication fails, and how emerging powers like Burkina Faso are redefining the rules of engagement in Africa news today. As this story draws to a close, one reality remains impossible to ignore. The greatest damage caused by this incident was not mechanical, diplomatic, or even international. It was institutional. The emergency landing of a Nigerian Air Force C-130 in a neighboring country should never have become a national controversy. Accidents happen, technical faults occur. Diplomacy exists precisely to manage moments like these calmly and efficiently. What turned a routine aviation issue into a public reckoning was the absence of clarity to families, clarity to citizens, and clarity to the world. When governments choose denial over documentation, reassurance over proof, and silence over explanation, they do not protect national pride. They erode it. For ordinary Nigerians, this episode reinforced a painful lesson. Information cannot be taken at face value when official narratives change faster than facts on the ground. For the families of the detained personnel, it exposed how vulnerable even uniformed service members can become when communication breaks down. And for observers abroad, it raised serious questions about preparedness, coordination, and accountability in moments of pressure. This is not a call for outrage. It is a call for standards. Strong nations are not defined by population size or military assets alone. They are defined by how responsibly they act when something goes wrong. Leadership is not measured by how quickly a problem is declared over, but by how transparently it is handled while it is still unfolding. There is also a broader regional lesson here. Across West Africa, a new political posture is emerging, one that insists on formal process-written communication and respect for sovereignty, regardless of history or hierarchy. Countries like Burkina Faso are signaling that informal assurances are no longer sufficient. In this environment, credibility is currency and paperwork matters as much as power. Figures such as Ibrahim Traore have become symbolic of this shift, representing a generation of leadership that prioritizes control of narrative through procedure rather than persuasion. Whether one agrees with this approach or not, it is shaping the future of Africa news and redefining expectations for how states interact. The warning then is clear. In an age of instant headlines and viral misinformation, truth cannot survive without discipline. Governments that fail to communicate formally and consistently will find themselves battling not foreign adversaries, but their own credibility. So we leave you with this final question. If transparency is optional, what happens when the next crisis is far bigger than an emergency landing? Please share this story if you believe accountability matters more than appearances. Subscribe if you believe truth should never depend on repetition. And in the comments below, tell us, honestly, can trust be rebuilt once silence becomes a habit?